On the night of August 14th, 1827, a terrible quiet hung over Marshbend Plantation. The heat of the South Carolina low country clung to every wall of the house, pressing into the floorboards and thickening the air as though nature itself were holding its breath. Inside the library of the main house, planter Josiah Crane sat at his desk, reviewing his accounts and sipping brandy. He believed the night would end like any other heavy with heat, worry, and the distant hum of insects from the rice fields dotted. Ended instead with violence so shocking that even hardened Charleston officials struggled to understand it. When the servants burst into the library minutes later, Crane's body lay sprawled across the floor. His skull had been crushed inward, shattered with such overwhelming force that bone fragments had embedded themselves into the mahogany desk 6 feet away. Blood streaked the floorboards and spattered the books on the shelves. The coroner's report, still preserved today in the Charleston County Archives, stated that the injuries were consistent with massive compression applied by hands of extraordinary size and strength. There was only one person on the plantation capable of such an act, Sarah Drummond. Crane had purchased 4 years earlier. A woman nearly 6 feet 8 inches tall, more than 240 pounds of hard muscle, whose hands were said to be large enough to encircle a man's head. A woman who had been beaten, displayed, worked to exhaustion, and finally had her only child taken from her that very afternoon by the time Crane's body was discovered. Sarah had vanished into dark swamps behind Marshbend. She disappeared, so completely that no patrol, no dogs, and no slave catchers ever found her again, for almost 2 centuries. People have argued over whether Sarah Drummond was real or just a myth born out of guilt and fear. But the documents, sale papers, medical examinations, eyewitness accounts, and Crane's own ruined skull tell a grim truth. Sarah was real. Her suffering was real. And whatever happened in the library that night was the final eruption of a nightmare that had been building for years. To understand how that night came to pass, we have to go back to where this story truly began, not with murder, but with money. In the spring of 1823, Charleston pulsed with the noise and motion of one of its busiest trading seasons in decades. Ships crowded the harbor, their hulls heavy with goods and with people. Vessels from the Caribbean, West Africa, and Virginia arrived weekly, each one delivering human cargo to be sold at the city's slave markets on Chalmers Street and Gadsden's Wharf. Charleston was more than a port. It was the beating heart of the domestic slave trade in the American South. Men bought and sold enslaved people as casually as rice barrels or cotton bales. The surrounding rice plantations were infamous for their brutality. Unlike cotton fields, rice cultivation demanded that workers stand submerged in murky water for hours each day, battling leeches, snakes, alligators, and clouds of mosquitoes carrying malaria. Mortality was so shockingly high that some historians estimate nearly 1/3 of enslaved workers died in their first year on a rice plantation. Owners constantly purchased new laborers to replace those who had been worked to death. It was into this grim economy that trader Caleb Rutherford arrived in Charleston in March of 1823. He brought with him a coffle of 37 people he had bought in Virginia and North Carolina. Among them was a young woman who immediately drew the crowd's attention. She towered above the others, her head nearly brushing the frame of the auction house door. Her enormous frame and broad, muscular build made her seem almost unreal, as if shaped by different hands than those that formed ordinary people. The auction papers listed her simply as Sarah. No last name, no record of family. Born in the Piedmont region of North Carolina, she had been moved from place to place so often that even those who grew up with her could no longer remember the name of her mother. Observers said she was close to 7 feet tall, with hands so large they could wrap all the way around a grown man's head. Today, doctors might call her condition pituitary gigantism, but in 1823, the crowd saw something else entirely: an oddity, a curiosity, a spectacle. On a blistering Tuesday morning, hundreds gathered to witness her sale. James Vanderhorst, the auctioneer, was a stout man accustomed to barking prices over the noise of restless buyers. Even he paused when Sarah stepped onto the wooden platform. The murmuring rose into a wave of whispers. Men craned their necks to see her. Some stared with fascination, others with fear. The bidding began at $400, already high for a young woman. It climbed rapidly. 800, 1,000. 1,100 as wealthy planters competed to claim her, not merely as a worker, but as a rarity, a living exhibit to parade before guests. Finally, a voice from the back ended the contest with a staggering offer. $1,300, one of the highest prices ever paid for a single enslaved person in Charleston that year. The buyer was Josiah Crane, owner of Marshbend Plantation, a mid-sized rice farm 18 miles southwest of the city. A strict man with a reputation for showing no mercy, Crane believed he had just made a valuable investment, one that would earn him money, status, and something even more intoxicating. Attention. As Sarah was led from the platform, wrists bound, and a leather collar burned with Crane's property mark around her neck. She did not cry, speak, or resist. She simply stared ahead with dark, unreadable eyes. Her massive frame moved with a strange quietness, almost a dignity. But as Crane guided her toward his wagon, an elderly free black woman selling flowers near the market watched them pass. She shook her head and muttered just loudly enough for bystanders to hear. That man just bought his own death. It would take 4 years for her words to come true. The road to that night began with this purchase one transaction among thousands, yet unlike any the city had ever seen. The wagon carrying Sarah left Charleston before dawn, its wheels rattling over the rough road that wound through the low country. As the city faded behind them, the land opened into a world of tidal creeks, cypress swamps, and endless rice fields shimmering beneath the heat. Marshbend Plantation lay 80 miles southwest of Charleston. But the journey felt far longer hours of humid air, buzzing insects, and the heavy silence between master and captive. When they reached the property, the first thing Sarah saw was the main house, a 2-story Georgian structure with white columns and a wide porch overlooking the sprawling rice marshes. At a glance, it looked peaceful, almost elegant, but the beauty of the place masked the brutality that gave it life. Behind the house stood a small cluster of buildings, the overseer's cottage, the kitchen house, a rice mill, a barn, and a long row of 12 slave cabins made from rough-hewn wood. These cabins had dirt floors, no windows, and leaky roofs barely enough to keep out the rain, certainly not enough to keep out the misery. The fields stretched beyond the cabins, an endless maze of dikes, ditches, and floodgates that controlled the tidal waters of the Ashley River. Working these fields meant standing waist-deep in muddy water for hours each day, hauling logs, clearing brush, planting and harvesting rice under a sun that seemed determined to kill anything not born to its heat. It was into this harsh world that Sarah was placed. Cabin number 7 became her home, shared with 5 other women who eyed her with a mixture of awe, fear, and pity. To fit through the cabin doorway, she had to stoop, and when she straightened her back inside, she nearly touched the rafters. Porter Grimball, the overseer, a thin, nervous man with watery eyes, wrote to his brother in Columbia describing her as an ancient colossus more than a Christian woman. The sort of observation meant to impress and to warn. But Crane had not spent $1,300 merely to work her in the fields. His intentions revealed themselves almost immediately. Within the first week, he began showing Sarah off like an attraction in a traveling circus. He invited neighboring planters, merchants from Charleston, and curious travelers to Marshbend to view the giant woman. Sarah was taken to the main house in order to stand in the parlor while Crane boasted about her height and strength. Guests asked her to stretch out her hands so they could place their own inside them. Comparing size as though she were an exotic animal rather than a human being, Crane forced her to lift heavy objects, iron anvils, sacks of rice, even livestock, while his guests laughed, marveled, or stepped back in fear. She did everything silently, her face unreadable. The humiliations varied, but the pattern was always the same. Sarah was not a worker, not a woman, not a person. She was a spectacle, a tool to elevate Crane's status, and when she was not being displayed, she was worked nearly to collapse. Life in the rice fields was deadly for any laborer. But for someone of Sarah's size, the physical strain was relentless. She moved logs that required two ordinary men. She operated heavy wooden pestles with terrifying speed. She cleared more brush in an hour than others did in a day. Her strength made her valuable, but it also made her vulnerable, because punishments delivered to someone her size served as a warning to everyone else. It wasn't long before Crane began using her as a public example. Sometimes she was blamed for working too slowly, other times for standing too tall or simply for existing in a way that unsettled him. The punishments were brutal whipping posts, wooden stocks, the buck, where she was forced into a cramped, agonizing position for hours. Grimball mentioned at least 3 such punishments in his letters, but Sarah never broke. Even as her back was bloodied, even as she staggered from exhaustion, she stood afterward with her spine straight and her eyes dark and calm. Witnesses from the slave quarters later recalled that her silence was more frightening than any scream. They began calling her Tall Sarah, or simply the wall, because once she planted her feet, nothing moved her unless she allowed it. And gradually, quietly, she became something more than feared. She became protective. Several testimonies, given years later, describe Sarah stepping between overseers and children, lifting fainted workers from the fields, or shielding families from Crane's anger. Her strength, meant to intimidate, was instead becoming a source of safety. Mothers whispered blessings in her direction. Older men said she was touched by God. Children believed she was invincible. Crane sensed this shift, though he never admitted it. He could hurt Sarah, but he could not silence her presence. The more he tried to assert control, the more the enslaved community began to look to her, not as a savior, but as someone who would not bend. Her quiet refusal to break frightened Crane more than her size ever had. For now, an uneasy balance held. But underneath the daily suffering and forced obedience, something dangerous was forming in Sarah. A resolve, a silent promise, the kind that breaks only once, and when it does, it destroys everything in its path. By the summer of 1824. Sarah had been at Marshbend for more than a year, long enough for the rhythms of plantation life to swallow months like quicksand. The days bled together: sunrise labor, endless heat, evening exhaustion, and Crane's constant intrusions into the slave quarters whenever he wanted to display his giant woman to curious visitors. Sarah endured it all without complaint, though those who observed her carefully noticed something shifting deep beneath the surface. Her silence was no longer submission. It was gathering. The turning point came in June of 1824, when a wealthy Charleston promoter named Augustus Peyton arrived at Marshbend. Peyton was a man who smelled profit everywhere he looked, and the moment he saw Sarah, he imagined her as the centerpiece of a traveling exhibition, a show of strange wonders, curiosities of nature, and scientific oddities destined to draw crowds from Savannah to Philadelphia. He offered Crane $300 to borrow Sarah for 2 weeks. To Crane, who loved prestige almost as much as money, it was an irresistible offer. Displaying Sarah publicly in Charleston would elevate his standing among planters and merchants, and Peyton promised even more profits if the show succeeded. So Crane called Sarah to the main yard one afternoon and announced she would be leaving for Charleston in 2 days. He expected her to nod silently, or at most look confused. Instead, she simply looked at him and spoke 2 quiet words that struck everyone nearby like lightning. "I will not." Crane froze. For a moment, he didn't seem to understand what he had heard. No enslaved person spoke to him like that, least of all Sarah, whom he considered the most valuable and therefore the most controllable. He repeated the order, louder. This time, as if volume would force obedience, Sarah did not bow her head. Her voice did not shake. "I will not go." It was the first time she had openly refused him. Witnesses later described Crane's face turning an alarming shade of red. His posture stiffened with humiliation. He demanded to know what she meant, but Sarah didn't explain, didn't beg, didn't offer excuses. She simply stood there, unmoving, as if the earth itself held her in place. Crane reacted the only way a man like him could through violence. He ordered Porter Grimball, the overseer, to take Sarah to the whipping post and punish her immediately. Grimball hesitated, glancing at Sarah's size, but Crane barked the order again. The overseer signaled for help, and 3 men approached her with ropes and canes. That was when the story took a turn no one forgot. The 4 men pushed and tugged at Sarah, but she didn't fight. She simply didn't move. She planted her feet into the red dirt and became immovable. They pulled until their muscles trembled, struck her legs, rammed their shoulders into her like battering rams, but Sarah remained rooted. It took 8 men. Ropes tied around her arms, and the threat of punishing others before she finally allowed herself to be taken to the post. The punishment that followed was brutal, even by the cruel standards of rice plantations. The overseer delivered 30 lashes with a braided leather whip. Blood soaked through Sarah's dress. Her back opened in deep, terrible wounds. But through the entire ordeal or so, Grimball wrote in a shaken letter, Sarah made no sound. Not a scream, not a gasp, not even a grunt. She endured the violence with the same rigid stillness she had shown when refusing Crane's order. When the ropes were cut loose, Sarah didn't collapse. She didn't cry. She simply stood, breathed slowly, and walked back to her cabin under her own power, leaving a trail of blood behind her. She did not go to Charleston. Crane canceled the arrangement with a lie about illness. But something irreversible had happened. The enslaved people at Marshbend whispered about Sarah's refusal for weeks. They had seen her bleed, but they had also seen something far more powerful, her ability to make Crane retreat. Her silence, once a shield, had turned into a weapon. Crane, on the other hand, sensed his authority slipping. He was used to controlling bodies, not wills. Sarah's defiance humiliated him, wounded him in a way that no amount of money or cruelty could fix. After that day, things changed, but not all at once. Crane still forced her into demonstrations when visitors arrived, though fewer came now. He still punished her, though less frequently, and always with a nervous edge. The enslaved community still depended on her strength, and Sarah continued to stand between the overseer and those too weak to defend themselves, but beneath the surface, a quiet war had begun. Crane needed Sarah to obey. Sarah had discovered she did not have to. The fragile balance between them trembled like a rope stretched too tight. And when it finally snapped, it would unleash a chain of events that no one on the plantation, least of all Josiah Crane, could stop. The breaking point was coming, and it would begin not with defiance, not with violence, but with something far more human. Love. Winter came slowly to the low country. The swamps never fully cooled, the mosquitoes never fully slept, and the air kept its heavy, wet grip even as the days shortened. But in early 1826, as the rice fields browned and the nights finally turned sharp and cold, something new stirred in Cabin 7, something small, fragile, and astonishing in a place built on suffering. Sarah Drummond was pregnant. No one knew for certain when the whispers began. Some remembered seeing her pause more often in the fields, pressing a hand to her lower back. Others noticed she was moving a little slower, though still far faster and stronger than any ordinary laborer. But it wasn't until March that the midwives, Hester and Dina, confirmed what many already suspected. Even then, the news spread quietly, carried on hushed voices through the slave quarters. Like a fragile flame protected from the wind, pregnancy on a plantation brought fear and hope in equal measure. A child meant family, but it also meant risk of punishment, risk of separation, risk of losing the only thing in the world you could still call your own. And at Marshbend, under Josiah Crane's ownership, that risk was doubled. But Sarah was not alone. The father was Marcus, a soft-spoken carpenter who had arrived at Marshbend 2 years earlier, after being purchased at an estate sale in Georgetown. He was skilled in carpentry and in the engineering knowledge required to maintain the complex irrigation system that kept the rice fields alive. Marcus was quiet, gentle, thoughtful, the kind of man who fixed things not just with his hands. But with patience, he had lost his wife and daughter years before, sold away from him in a single morning. He carried that loss silently, stitching it into every piece of wood he touched up, and slowly, quietly, Sarah and Marcus gravitated toward each other, not with fiery passion, but with the weary recognition of two people who understood what it meant to live in chains. After long days in the fields, they would sit together outside the cabins, speaking in low tones that only the night could hear. Some nights they spoke of the past, other nights of the world beyond the swamps. Most nights they simply sat together, finding comfort in the presence of someone who asked nothing from them. Theirs was not a romance written in fire. It was a partnership carved from survival. When the midwives told Marcus about the child, he didn't smile. Smiling was dangerous in a place like Marshbend. But he touched Sarah's arm and whispered, "This time, we will try to keep what is." Ours, Sarah's pregnancy was difficult from the beginning. Her immense size, once a source of strength, made the burden of carrying a child agonizing. She worked in the fields longer than she should have because Crane demanded it. Rice planters rarely gave concessions, but the women around her watched her closely, offering water, taking extra tasks when possible, shielding her from Crane's temper. Even so, the pain grew. Some nights she could barely sleep, her breathing ragged, her muscles trembling. Sometimes she sat awake, holding her belly with both hands, whispering to the child she had not yet met. Crane also noticed, not because he cared about her safety, but because he saw money. A child born to a woman of Sarah's size, he believed, could be valuable, perhaps even more valuable than Sarah herself. He joked about how much the baby might fetch at auction. He wondered aloud which plantation might want a bread giant. House servants carried these scraps of information back to Sarah, and each word settled in her heart like a stone. Fear crept into her, cold and relentless. This child was hers, and Crane wanted him before he was even born. One of the coldest nights of January 1827 brought the day Sarah had both feared and hoped for. Labor began shortly after midnight. The midwives rushed into cabin 7 while the wind rattled the gaps in the wooden boards. Outside, a thin crust of frost coated the ground. Unusual for the low country, but fitting for the night, a storm would be born. Sarah, who never cried out during beatings, screamed that night. Her voice carried across the frozen fields, waking the enslaved community and even Crane himself in the main house. He came outside with a lantern, not to help, but to listen. Morbid curiosity pulling him to the edge of the slave quarters. The labor dragged on for hours. Sweat drenched Sarah's body in spite of the cold. The midwives whispered prayers, urging her to hold on. And then, just before dawn, as the first pale light crept over the rice marshes, the child arrived. A boy, nearly 11 pounds, impossibly big for a newborn in such harsh conditions, but healthy, breathing, strong. When he cried, Sarah broke. For the first time anyone had ever seen, tears ran down her face. She cradled him against her chest, as if afraid the world might snatch him away in an instant. She whispered to him in a voice soft as thunder in the distance. She studied his hand, his nose, the dimples on his cheeks, memorizing everything, as though she knew she had to. Marcus entered shortly after sunrise, moving slowly due to his own wounds and the brutal winter chill. He stood beside Sarah, looking down at the child who represented a second chance he never thought he'd have. He carved a small wooden horse for the baby in the days that followed, smoothing the edges, shaping the tiny legs with careful reverence. They named him Jacob, not after anyone they knew, but after the biblical figure who wrestled angels and endured suffering yet lived. It was a name of survival, a name with roots deeper than the swamp mud beneath their feet. For a few precious weeks, Cabin 7 knew something almost like joy. Sarah worked lighter duties, keeping Jacob close against her chest. Marcus added an extra, planked to the cabin wall to strengthen it, and fashioned a cradle from leftover wood. The enslaved community watched with quiet hope. daring to believe that maybe this time life might offer a sliver of mercy. But mercy was a currency Crane had never paid in, and soon his debts and his cruelty would tear everything apart. The summer of 1827 arrived heavy and suffocating, the kind of heat that turned the air thick enough to taste. The swamps hummed with insects, the rice fields shimmered under a white sun, and every living thing seemed to move slower except time itself, because by August, the fragile peace around Sarah and Jacob was coming undone. Marshbend, for all its outward order, was drowning in quiet crisis. Josiah Crane was in trouble. Deep trouble. His shipping investments in Charleston had collapsed. Several merchants he owed money to were demanding repayment. The price of rice had dipped after a poor harvest year. And Crane, a man too proud to admit failure, had been dancing at the edge of disaster for months by midsummer. His debts threatened to swallow the plantation whole. There's only one quick way for a man in his situation: to raise cash, sell human beings. Enslaved people were counted as assets like cattle or tools. They could be liquidated easily, quietly, and for large sums. Crane had done it before, splitting families without a second thought, turning grief into profit with the stroke of a pen. But now he needed more than a few $100s. He needed enough to keep Marshbend from being seized. He needed $400 immediately, and more soon after. That was when Nathaniel Gadsden, a notorious slave trader, arrived at Marshbend on a blistering August afternoon. Gadsden was a tall, fox-faced man who had made a career buying desperate men's excess property at reduced prices, only to sell the same people in Charleston or Savannah for twice the money. His voice was soft, his smile pleasant, and his cruelty legendary. The moment Gadsden stepped onto the property, Crane saw a way out, and Gadsden saw something even more valuable. He saw Jacob. Jacob was 6 months old by then, big, strong, and alert, with bright eyes and a quiet curiosity about the world. He had Sarah's broad face and Marcus's calm demeanor. He slept in the cradle Marcus had built, carved with small wooden animals that Sarah traced with her finger, when she put him down for the night to Sarah and Marcus. Jacob was a miracle, a piece of their humanity returned to them after years of brutality. But to Gadsden, he was inventory. Babies brought high prices in Savannah, especially for wealthy families who wanted a house servant raised from birth. Investors liked them young. They could shape them easily. Gadsden approached Crane after their tour of the property and gestured toward the garden where Sarah was working with Jacob strapped to her back, sleeping peacefully in a sling. "That child," Gadsden said, "is worth money." Crane hesitated. He had not seriously considered selling Jacob alone. To him, Jacob was a bargaining chip to control Sarah, but desperation made men flexible. And Gadsden was offering $400. Cash on the spot, the exact amount Crane needed to keep his creditors from closing in. The conversation was overheard by Peter, a young boy hiding behind a stack of cut wood. Years later, in a courthouse far from the plantation, Peter would recount every word. "400, Gadsden repeated. "Today, I take him with me when I leave." Sarah's back stiffened the moment she heard the discussion. She didn't turn, didn't speak, but every muscle in her body coiled tight. Crane glanced at her, then at the baby, then at Gadsden. "I need to think," he said. But everyone who heard the conversation that day, every enslaved person who felt the tension in the air, knew the truth. He didn't need to think. He needed the money. That night, the quarters buzzed with whispers. They whispered of terror, of dread, of Sarah's eyes staring long into the darkness. They whispered of Crane's debts and Gadsden's greed. They whispered of Jacob's soft breathing and Sarah's fierce, silent embrace. Inside cabin 7, Sarah and Marcus sat on the floor, with Jacob between them. No one knows exactly what they said. Their words died in the air, carried only by the walls that had witnessed every joy and heartbreak they'd endured. But their decision was clear. Marcus would run. Not to escape for himself, he knew the danger too well, but to go north, to Charleston, to find anyone who could intervene or delay the sale. Sarah stitched a tiny map of the area into the lining of his coat. She wrote a plea simple: desperate begging whoever found him to help save her child. Marcus kissed Jacob's forehead in the candlelight dot, then he slipped into the night. He didn't get far by noon the next day. A slave patrol's dogs had followed his scent to a muddy creek. They brought him back to Marshbend, bloodied, torn, exhausted, but alive. Sarah's hope collapsed in on itself. Crushing her from the inside out, Crane was livid. He ordered all enslaved people to gather. Marcus was tied to the whipping post. Crane removed his coat, rolled up his sleeves, and delivered each lash himself. 50 stripes. By the 10th, Marcus's back was a map of torn flesh. By the 20th, he was barely conscious. By the 50th, his body hung limp, held upright only by ropes. Sarah stood in front, holding Jacob against her chest. She never blinked. She never looked away. Witnesses later said that Marcus, in brief moments of lucidity, lifted his head just enough to look at her and her alone. When the punishment ended, Crane turned to Sarah. "Tomorrow," he said coldly, "Gadsden will return for your son. You will hand him over quietly. If you resist, Marcus dies." Sarah did not speak. She did not bow. She only stared at Crane with eyes so dark and silent that even he stepped back. That night, Marshbend went still. No insects sang. No voices murmured. It was as if the land itself sensed the approaching storm. In cabin 7. Sarah held Jacob in her arms long after he had fallen asleep, gently stroking his hair, memorizing every detail of his little face. This was the last night her world would remain whole. Tomorrow, the breaking point finally arrived. The morning of August 14th, 1827, dawned with the sun the color of blood rising over the marsh. Old people on the plantation would later say the sky had been a warning, one of those rare, unsettling dawns, when the world seems to know something terrible is coming. But the day began like any other, with pain, heat, and routine. Sarah rose before the first rooster crowed. She fed Jacob, dressed him in the cleanest little gown she had sewn, and held him against her chest for a long time, memorizing the warmth of his small body. She whispered to him in a voice no one else could hear, a soft rumble like distant thunder. Then she placed him gently in the cradle Marcus had built and stepped outside to begin her work. She moved through the garden, mechanically pulling weeds, trimming vines, carrying baskets. Her face was blank, her eyes fixed somewhere far beyond the fields, as though she were already halfway gone. When other women tried to speak to her, she did not answer. When they offered food, she pushed it away. Her silence was so deep it frightened them. Around midday, Nathaniel Gadsden's wagon rolled up the long dirt drive, its wheels cutting new scars into the earth. His assistant held the reins while Gadsden climbed down with a folded bill of sale in his hand. He went straight to the main house, where Crane waited in the library with a fresh glass of brandy and an air of stiff confidence. Inside, the transaction was completed in minutes. $400 changed hands. Ownership papers were signed. The baby who slept in cabin 7, a boy who had never seen the world beyond the marsh, was now legally the property of a stranger. Crane sent word to Sarah through Ruth, the house servant. "Bring the child." Ruth dreaded delivering the message. She found Sarah standing in the garden, still as stone. When she spoke the words, Sarah did not cry, did not shout, did not shake. She only nodded once and walked toward the cabins, her movements slow and deliberate. Minutes later, Sarah emerged from cabin 7, holding Jacob. The enslaved people who saw her pass lowered their heads, some weeping, others gripping each other's arms as though bracing for a storm. The air felt sharp, brittle. One wrong breath could break it. Sarah climbed the steps of the main house and disappeared inside. What happened in that library was pieced together. Later, through Ruth's testimony, Grimball's statements, and Crane's own shattered office. Sarah entered the room and stopped just outside the doorway. Jacob pressed against her chest. Gadsden stood off to the side, uneasy. Crane, behind his desk, gestured for her to come closer. She did not move. "Give the child to Mr. Gadsden," Crane said. Silenced, Sarah looked at Gadsden, then at Crane, then at Jacob. When she spoke, her voice was so low they had to strain to hear it. "Please." It was the first time anyone had ever heard Sarah beg. Crane's face hardened. "The matter is settled, Sarah." Give him the child. Her arms tightened around Jacob. She whispered, "Please, I will work harder. I will do anything. Just don't take my child." Gadsden shifted uncomfortably. Even he seemed shaken. Crane stood, impatience cracking through his voice. "You forget yourself? You are property. The child is property. Give him over now." Sarah stared at him for a long time. Then she kissed Jacob on the forehead and, with hands trembling for the first time in her life, held him out. Gadsden stepped forward and took the baby. Jacob began to cry. Something inside Sarah broke or crystallized. Her hand stayed outstretched long after Jacob was gone, as though her mind couldn't accept that her arms were empty. Crane, eager to end the uncomfortable scene, muttered empty reassurances about a good home, and told her to return to her duties. She did not answer. She only turned and walked out. Sarah stood outside. Cabin 7 for nearly an hour after Gadsden's wagon rolled away. Long after the baby's cries had faded into the distance, the plantation was too quiet. Even the cicadas seemed to hush themselves by dusk. The enslaved community sensed something dangerous gathering in the air-like heat building beneath a sealed lid. As night fell, Sarah entered her cabin. She did not light a candle. She sat on the floor, staring at the empty cradle Marcus had carved with his trembling hands. For hours she didn't move, didn't speak, didn't breathe in any way that suggested she was still connected to the world. Around her. Around 9 p.m. She stood. She blew out the candle, and she stepped into the darkness. Outside, Solomon, an elderly field hand walking back from the latrines, saw her silhouette cutting across the yard, a towering shape that moved with the slow inevitability of a storm pulling itself together. He called out to her. She did not answer. She kept walking. At 9:30 p.m. The clock in Crane's library stopped the exact moment Sarah entered through the kitchen door. The rest is a handful of seconds carved into legend. Crane shouted first anger, then fear. A gunshot cracked through the house. Ruth screamed. Something heavy crashed into the desk. A sickening sound followed. Wet, final, unearthly. By the time Grimball and 2 men arrived with rifles, Sarah was gone. The window behind the desk stood open. Blood stained the sill. The night swallowed everything beyond it. Crane lay dead on the floor, his skull crushed by the pressure of 2 enormous hands. The legend of Sarah Drummond was born in that moment, not from myth, but from a woman pushed past every human limit. From that instant onward, she became something no system of slavery could explain or control. She became the storm when the first light of August 15th, 1827 crept over Marshbend Plantation. It revealed a landscape twisted by terror. Word had spread through the quarters long before dawn, carried by trembling voices and the echo of Ruth's terrified screams. By sunrise, every enslaved person knew what had happened in Josiah Crane's library. The gunshot, the shouting, the final silence, and one truth settled heavier than the morning fog. Sarah was gone. The search began before the air had warmed. Overseer Grimball leading a frantic swarm of riders, dogs, and torch-bearing men into the swamps that bordered the plantation. They expected chaos, a trail of destruction, something to mark the path of a woman as large and wounded as Sarah. What they found instead chilled them to the bone. A single trail of blood. Small drops leading away from the house. Steady, purposeful, determined. The trail went past the fields, across the dikes, through the mud that sucked at their boots, and then simply vanished at the edge of the swamp, where the ground turned soft and the trees stood in tight ranks like soldiers guarding a secret. The blood trail stopped. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign that someone almost 7 feet tall had forced her way through the brush. It was as if Sarah had stepped into the swamp, and the swamp had swallowed her. Whole. The searchers fanned out in every direction. They shouted her name not out of respect but fear. Men who had beaten enslaved people without blinking now hesitated at every rustle in the undergrowth, every splash in the distant reeds. They held their rifles too tightly. Their dogs strained at their leashes, confused by the conflicting sense of blood, mud, and dents. Ancient forest dot the low country was not kind to pursuers. Cypress trees rose out of dark, water like pillars in a drowned cathedral. Spanish moss hung in long ghostly curtains. The heat was suffocating, the air thick with the smell of decay. Things moved beneath the water alligators, sliding like black shadows. Snakes curling between roots slick with algae. This was not land meant for men, but it was land that someone like Sarah, raised between cruelty and wilderness, might understand. Instinctively, hours passed. The sun rose higher, baking the men in their wool clothing. Dogs whined and grew restless. Torches sputtered out in the humid air, and still there was no sign of her dot by noon. The first murmurs began. She ain't human anymore. She walked straight into hell, and the devil took her. A witch. Always was unnatural. Superstition spread faster than the search. By evening, exhausted and terrified, the men returned to Marshbend empty-handed. Magistrates arrived from Charleston before sunset, accompanied by a doctor, the sheriff, and deputies who had no desire to enter the swamps at night. They examined Crane's broken corpse, took statements from Ruth and Grimball, and scribbled notes about extraordinary strength, brutal force, and marks consistent with oversized. The official report said Sarah had fled in a dangerous and disordered state, likely mortally wounded, and that her capture was a matter of urgency. Unofficially, everyone whispered the same thing. No one expected to find her alive. And yet, no one could explain the strange calm of the library window, the perfect absence of struggle at the edge of the swamp, the eerie way the trail simply dissolved. It was Ruth, what others feared to ask aloud. What if she didn't die? In Cabin 7, the enslaved people gathered in hushed groups, speaking Sarah's name with a mix of dread and reverence. The cradle Marcus had carved remained in the room, empty and untouched. No one dared move it. It had become an altar of sorts, a reminder of what had been taken and what it had cost. Marcus lay in his own cabin, barely alive, drifting in and out of consciousness. He did not yet know Crane was dead. He did not know Sarah had vanished. He only whispered one name again and again through cracked lips. Jacob. Some said that when he heard the news days later, he neither wept nor spoke. He simply closed his eyes and turned his face toward the wall, accepting the truth like a man already halfway into the next world. As night fell over Marshbend. Something strange happened. The swamp came alive, the air filled with the croaking of frogs, the chirping of insects, the splash of unseen creatures. But threaded through all the sounds was a new noise, a faint, rhythmic movement, like something large slipping between trees far in the distance. Some said it was an alligator. Others said it was a panther. A few whispered that it was something else entirely, something walking upright, something searching, something with a fresh wound on its shoulder and a grief too deep to name. Sarah Drummond had entered the swamp. Whether she did so as a dying woman, a vengeful spirit, or a mother with nothing left to lose, no one on Marshbend ever knew. But legends often begin where certainty ends. And on that night, in that swamp, a legend took its first breath.